right, we're going to do us a little, I did a little carving recently of a little slave. Well, what it was a little, I read a story about a slave who, after the Civil War, became a dairy farmer. And so I'm going to do that in miniature. I went ahead and used the same pattern as I used for the little man, and I just put a little hat on him. Now, I could have carved the hat on him, but I wanted to put a little bit bigger hat on him, the way I wanted to do it. This is only right now about 3 inches high. That's all. It's 3 inches high, and the grain, of course, will be running this way, up and down. And I thought this would be a nice little project to show you how to do. Let me get my... Now, I want to explain something to you. I use a carving glove, but that carving glove that I had last time to do for the little figure, it was so big and so outstandish that it what I mean is it has a yellow look to it, and it's just sort of overbearing the whole picture, in other words, when I had it on. So I'm just gonna, just for sake of you being able to see much better, I'm going to not use one. I'm going to go ahead and draw the... Now, on a case like this, I've already got him kind of cut out, and I'm basically going to use the same type of pattern that I use for all these figures. And these are the shoes down here, of course. I'm just kind of getting some wood away just to establish. Just like that. Okay, the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and separate the head from the hat. So that I can kind of work on that a little bit. It was an interesting story that I read. It was about a slave who became a dairy farmer after the war. A lot of times after the Civil War, they to be honest with you, the North, I'm not going to get into this too much, but I'm a Civil War buff, and unfortunately in our schools today, it's being taught that slavery was the main factor of the Civil War. I just don't believe that. In my studies of the Civil War, and it's not because I live in the South or anything like that, that slavery was not the main factor of the Civil War. But of course, any war involves money. And if you read that the situation was that the North wanted the South to succeed, to be a part of the Northern basis. And at that time, the South was the greatest producers of cotton. And cotton was at that time was a valuable resource. It was like oil is today. Cotton was extremely valuable. So the North basically wanted the South to sell all their cotton to the North. And the South refused. And so they wanted them to be a part of the Union, so I'm sure that they would be able to obtain a portion of, because the cotton business was very, very profitable, and they wanted to be a part of it. Well, the South basically said, no, we're not going to do that, and if you try to force us to, then we're going to succeed from the Union. And so that's basically was one of the portions that started the war, and you say, well, how in the world, you mean the war could have been started over cotton? Sure. I mean, all wars 90% of the time are started over money and property. In other words, people start wars to take over a nation or take over property that they have or whatever. In other words, you look at the great leaders of the warriors, and they're Alexander the Great. They went around ravaging land and taking land from the. I'm going to start on the hat too, right here. Land from the people. So the Civil War was about land. It was about wanting something that the other person had. And slavery really didn't become an issue until a year and a half into the Civil War. They believe that, and I've read Shelby Foote, who's the great historian of the Civil War, and others, and I've been to Gettysburg and all those places, and I'm not saying I'm the most knowledgeable person on the Civil War, but it wasn't just about slavery. It was about success, and that the North decided they wanted to be their own states. They had their own currency, the Confederate currency, things like that, and they wanted to be themselves. And of course, the Union said, no, you're not going to do that. So they started a war over it, and a lot of people died. It was just so the Civil War to me has always been an interesting factor. But leading on to that, after the Civil War, Lincoln, slavery became an issue because the North at first was losing the war. And I don't know if many people know this or not, but they didn't even let colored men fight in the Civil War. It wasn't until later on into the war, very long into the war, before they even let colored troops fight. So, and there was some slavery in the North at that time, but it wasn't like the South, of course, because the South had plantations. Now, what happened after the war is, so I'm cutting down the hat right now. I'm cutting down that. So after the war, Lincoln basically, he had all these slaves, and what he did, he gave them a lot of land, or he gave them some land and to build them a farm on and stuff like that, because most of these men and their families were already familiar with working crops and stuff, and he gave them a lot of land, and they became farmers. And this was a story about a slave who became a dairy farmer after the Civil War. So I had read the story, and it was quite interesting. It really was, how he became a successful dairy farmer. And I believed a lot of things about the Civil War too until I really got to studying them. It wasn't just about slavery. It was, and most wars are not fought over a specific cause. I mean, they're fought over land, they're fought over money, they're fought over those things. I mean, there's a purpose. People invade other countries because of because of a purpose. Okay, so I'm getting this hat down, and so it was an interesting article. It was very interesting, and so there are a lot of people today that they want to use the issue of slavery as a sort of a sounding board for their causes. But I remember, if you remember, during the Civil War, people talk about the North being so compassionate toward, the colored people, and during the war, Civil War, they came out with a rule. The North was having some issues, and they had lost a lot of men and a lot of desertion, a lot from diseases and things like that. So they decided to make it a rule that they had a draft. They instigated the draft, and they said that if you had $300, you could get out of the draft. If you paid them $300, you could get out of the draft. And of course, that was because the politician, they could, had that kind of money, and they could keep their sons and grandsons and all these things out of the draft. And of course, there was revolt over this as the people began to understand that. And there was riots, and I believe it was in New York, over this, and they began to murder. That when they found black people on the streets or anything like that, they murdered them. So it was a riot that had occurred. And so back at that time, even in the North, your black people were not even considered as human beings, or could vote and do things like that. So, there's a lot of and a lot of people say, well, that's what you think because you're down in the South. But no, I going to study the Civil War, to really study it by some of the great men who've wrote about the Civil War, and you see these things because, like I said, you think about war, whether it was a Civil War or any war, it's fought over why did Japan try to take us over. It was because they were trying to take over America, because they saw the German army moving as they did. So, all right, we're getting the hat down, and of course this is going to have to come down even more. This is too thick. But most people fight wars to gain something. And it wasn't just about slavery. It was about gaining control over the South as well. And unfortunately, our history books, I know people want a cause. So they'll use whatever cause they can to make things seem a way. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to to me, there were brave men and women who fought on both sides. And like I said, most of the people that fought the war, the South had a bunch of old farm boys. Most of them didn't, they didn't know much about war. And I remember at Manassas, the war wasn't supposed to be that long. They thought it was just going to be over in just a little bit of time. Never did they know it would last 4 years. Okay. Now let's look at our little figure here. and it's going to have to come down a lot more. He's not going to be fat, that's for sure. Most slaves were not heavy-set people. They were, now, most of them were in tremendous shape. They were, because they had worked the farms. Okay, we're going to have the hands coming down, basically. But sometimes we just want to, well, we want to change history. We want to, because we want it to match our cause, you know. And but slavery did become an issue later on in the war, because it was also a very good sounding brass for, because after the war had been going on for about 3 years, the people really got tired of it and wanted it to be ended, and wanted Lincoln to end the war, because so many people had died. I mean, you think about it for a minute, 625,000 people died in the Civil War. And that's horrendous. I mean, it's just, I think more died in the Civil War than all the other wars put together. So that is a horrendous amount of people who died. Okay, now we're going to do the same for the other side. We're going to put the hands down, just like that. That's why he's a little bit thicker. He's 1 1/4 inches thick, but he's thicker so that we can get these hands to working right, to where they... I have visited Gettysburg. I've visited other places like that. If you haven't ever had a chance to visit those places, do. They're wonderful, wonderful places to visit, especially if you're, even if you're not a Civil War buff or study the Civil War all that much. They're great places to visit and just see where some of the great battles were fought. And okay, what I'm doing is I'm making room here for, as you see on both sides, because he's going to be carrying some milk jugs, and so I wanted to get that, trying to kind of work on the piece. Of course, I like history, always have. I mean, down in Texas we have the Alamo, and you know, there's been things about the Alamo that I don't know. I didn't really study the Alamo all that much. That Davy Crockett really didn't die at the Alamo, and he was later executed by Santa, and that could have happened. I'm not saying it didn't. I'm just saying it could have, but where that did, there was some brave men and women who fought at the Alamo. And of course, I know we change history a little bit too. We change it to fit our needs. Okay. A little place there where the... All right. So we've got the arms kind of established. And of course these shoes are going to have to come down a lot. So let's go ahead and bring this head down also in here. Now the brim of the hat is of course too thick, so it all has to be brought down, whether we like it or not. But I'll tell you what, there were a lot of slaves that after the war, because you got to realize something. Most of these slaves couldn't read or write. Most of them had been cheated out of an education, so they naturally were not intelligent enough to start a lot of things. I mean, they were just treated badly, and they were more than that. They were denied educations. In fact, I think it was even against the law for a slave to even learn to read and write, because they knew that if they would read or write, well, then they would learn things. And so a lot of them after the war became farmers because that's what they knew. And some became very successful farmers because that's what they had done all their lives as far as growing crops and the fields and stuff. And it was all right. Let's go ahead and get this head down a little bit. All right, we will need to bring this down. I usually just go ahead and make the hat, but I want to make the hat a little bit bigger on this fella. In the fact that I could kind of push it up. Okay. I think about the fact that back then these people worked with their hands. And let's not anyone ever think that the black man was not extremely skilled in working and growing things. He was extremely skilled. And that's why I say when a lot of them became farmers afterwards, and they worked with their hands. And they were hard workers. Now their mistreatment was terrible. It was atrocious what had happened, and the way that the white plantation owners. Now, to be honest with you, not, and a lot of people associate the entire South with slavery. And you have to realize that probably plantation owners were very wealthy people. So not everybody in the South, and I don't know why people associate, but very few people in the South owned plantations. They owned farms, but they did not own plantations. So the majority of people in the South did not have slaves. Your rich plantation owners did. They had them to work the crops, they had them to work the fields and stuff like that. But a lot of people associate the South or Southern people or most of the Southern people back then as having slaves, and that's just not true. They did not have slaves because you had to be rather wealthy to own slaves. And the thing was, of course, slaves were not only used for Thomas Jefferson had slaves. They were used for working plantations, and they were also used for, excuse me, excuse the pun, but they were used for breeding. They were used for, so that they could produce, they were used to clean houses. They were used as basically maids and things like that to work these large plantations. And you couldn't have a plantation unless you were probably a pretty wealthy person. So there was a lot of people in the South that did not have plantations. They didn't have the money. So majority of the boys at fault on the southern side were from farms. They'd never even been out of their, that's why it was such a, they had never even been out of their areas, and all of a sudden they were thrown into a war. So, and always remember, folks, politicians fight wars, okay? It usually isn't, very often does the people, the normal person, start a war. They just don't. These are started by countries and politicians, and that's what happens. All right, let's look at our figure. We're getting it down now as we slowly bring this down. I wanted a little bit bigger hat on him. I just... And just like Vietnam, I was very much against Vietnam. And that's the thing that a lot of people need to understand, and it's because the way Vietnam was fought. But you can be against a war and still have great respect for the men who fought in it. I was against the Vietnam War. I was born in that era. I almost went to Vietnam. When I joined the service, it was in 71. So, excuse me, it was in 72. So basically the war was starting to wind down in Vietnam at that time. And so, but I was very much against the war. I felt it wasn't the way they should have fought it, and I don't know. I don't know what we were doing over in Vietnam, but I want to say one thing. Even though I was against the war in Vietnam, I still have great respect for the veterans who fought that war, because a lot of them didn't want to be over there either. And that's what you have to realize. They didn't want to be over there. So don't take it out on them. And that's why I will say now the NFL stuff is just, all right, is ridiculous. Okay. Here we go. Now, these shoes are going to have to be brought down. And I'm slowly, of course, the brim of this hat's going to have to be brought down even more. But I thought, well, okay. I think we're doing very, very well if you look from the side and stuff. And we will come back and we will continue this figure. Okay.